Thank you very much for these opening remarks and also setting the scene for the upcoming ministerial plenary discussion. This debate headline is Speed Up the Marathon, Reviving the EU's Enlargement Policy. And I would like to welcome here to the stage speakers of this panel discussion. Firstly, let me again invite here to the stage Martin Dvořák, Czech Minister for European Affairs. I would like to also welcome here Anna Lührmann, German Minister of State for Europe and Climate. I would also like to introduce you Marko Štucin, Slovenian State Secretary for European Affairs, and last but not least, Miodrag Vlahović, Ambassador and the President of the Montenegrin Helsinki Committee. And of course, let me also introduce you the moderator of this plenary panel discussion, Rob Cameron, BBC's Prague correspondent. Mr. Cameron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And welcome to this debate on the future of the EU's enlargement policy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has certainly breathed new life into the EU's enlargement process. In fact, Ursula von der Leyen said in Berlin at the beginning of this week that she'd like that Ukraine should begin formal accession talks by the end of June. And of course, that date is no accident, because on the 1st of July, Hungary takes over the presidency of the European Union. But of course, there are 9 candidates for membership, not only Ukraine, but Moldova, Georgia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Kosovo. In fact, I think technically there are 10 if you include Turkey, but I think a few people these days do include Turkey. And some, of course, are further along than others. And there are different stages to their application. Some are candidates, others are applicants, and so on. But in the cold light of day, how realistic are their chances? Some indeed think that the very idea of accepting Ukraine to the European Union, a country that is geographically the second biggest in Europe after Russia, a country that is at war, a country 18% of whose territory is occupied by another country, some people think that that idea is insane. It's a pipe dream. It'll never happen. What about Kosovo? Can we talk about Kosovo's prospective membership of the European Union when 5 of the EU's very members don't even recognize it as an independent state? And looking at the EU's process of accepting the countries of the Western Balkans, a process that, Martin, you described as slow and stagnant. If the EU is incapable of speedily, efficiently taking in new members, then should it really talk about taking in countries which are way larger, like Ukraine? So what can be done about all this? How can this process be sped up? And how, crucially, can this process be sold to the public? So, to our panel, just a few words of introduction. Martin, who spoke obviously at the beginning, is Czechia's minister, and I did say Czechia, not the Czech Republic, is Czechia's Minister for European Affairs. Martin spent 2 years in Kosovo as part of the United Nations mission for post-war reconstruction. He was later deployed to Iraq, working on that country's temporary administration in the south of the country. I think it was Basra, was it? And he also saw Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution at first hand as an OSCE observer. He's had several diplomatic and ministerial posts before he was appointed Europe Minister last year. Dr. Anna Lührmann is Germany's Minister of State for Europe and Climate. Dr. Lührmann has been passionate about climate protection and strengthening European democracy from an early age. She was the youngest MP, or member of the Bundestag, at the age of 19. She holds 2 master's degrees, one from Sudan, another from Humboldt University in Berlin, as well as a doctorate in political science. And she believes that a united Europe is vital as a guarantor of the EU's extremely ambitious climate policy. Marko Štucin is Slovenia's State Secretary for European Affairs. He has been a career diplomat at the Slovenian Foreign Ministry for almost 20 years. He's held posts in Berlin, but his work has also encompassed Latvia and The Hague, as well as responsibilities with the International Criminal Court and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And finally, Ambassador Miodrag Vlahović is the president of the Montenegrin Helsinki Committee. He was a key figure in the Montenegrin peace movement, founding the Citizens Committee for Peace and organizing Montenegro's first peace rally in 1991. He was an MP and the foreign minister of Montenegro in the period of the referendum on independence. And he was also the first Montenegrin ambassador to the United States, covering Canada and Iceland, and as well to the Holy See. And he holds a degree in law. So by my reckoning, the panelists represent one country that's been in the EU from the beginning in 1957, two countries from the 2004 wave of enlargement, the Czech Republic and Slovenia, one country waiting to join the EU, and me, a country from the 1973 wave of enlargement that so few people talk about today, but perhaps the less said about that, the better. I'd like to start just by talking about the European Parliament and the elections and your reaction to them. And I want to begin just by reading out a tweet, it's short, don't worry, by a guy called Mujtaba Rahman, who's from the Eurasia Group, and he's, I think, one of the smartest voices on Europe. A week ago, before the elections had finished, so before we knew the results, he said, "There'll be lots of noise over the next 2 days about the far-right surge in the European Union. The reality is more boring. First, because the centre will hold. Second, because although there will be more far-right MEPs in Brussels, they won't have a majority, and their lack of organisation will limit their impact." Well, the centre might have held. Ursula von der Leyen said the centre held, but the problems that the elections caused for the EU's biggest country, I suggest, especially France and Germany, does that mean that those big countries will now be so preoccupied by their own domestic politics that EU enlargement will simply slip down the agenda? I mean, surely the prospect of Madame Première Ministre Marine Le Pen as Prime Minister of France, that would end Ukraine's hopes of joining the EU in the foreseeable future. Perhaps, Martin, would you like to respond first of all?
Good morning, everyone, again. I thought you will ask Anna, because...
Yes, that's a good point.
Maybe she knows a little bit more than I do. But generally speaking, the results of election, as you said, are maybe not so dramatic as we expected and we was afraid of. On the other hand, it's not easy. And we don't know yet what real result of this election will we be facing. Because now is the ongoing procedure of set up of new groups, and nobody knows who is at the moment able to keep this 361 plus something to get majority, and what will be a future orientation or strategic orientation of the EU. But you ask especially about those two biggest countries. You are right. Both of them, the biggest members and influencing members, are in some internal trouble. What could bring the situation in which they will be not able to be focused so much about the EU, especially enlargement, because even before, especially France was not in favor of this so much. As you mentioned, and several times already has been said, only after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, there was some kind of wake-up call who showed that we really need to do something to protect our external border and to include those regions like Western Balkans and Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, maybe even Armenia now. You see the development in Armenia. They will also very soon, I guess, knocking on the door of EU, asking for some help and support. What is one side, and the second side is that we really now can say exactly what will be and should be the reaction of France, because they went from kind of skepticism towards enlargement for some stronger support with some kind of reservation, definitely. And now, I don't know, because I'm really a little bit afraid that the development with Macron's visions would be at least slow down. So I don't know, Anna.
Yes, Anna, as a representative of Germany, I mean, it was a pretty bad election for Olaf Scholz and a pretty bad election for those who would like to see much more emphasis on climate. It was a bad weekend for the Greens across Europe. But in terms of enlargement, what do you think that the results of the elections mean for that process?
No, indeed, it was for us quite a disappointing day or election result. When it comes to enlargement, unfortunately, at least in Germany, the proper EU topics have not played that much of a role during the election campaign. I mean, people like myself have always tried to focus the debate on this, but actually exit polls in Germany show that citizens were more likely to prioritize national issues in these elections than actually at the elections before. So we've seen sort of here really the problem that what we actually need a proper European elections with European issues that the European Parliament has a power to decide on at its center. That's not what we've seen, and I think as EU politicians that's something that we need to ask ourselves, how can we make sure that we create actually this European public debate vis-a-vis the next European election. So that's one point. Second, on the question of enlargement, indeed, we might come in some troubling times here. We know that parties have been rising both in France and in Germany that are skeptical towards enlargement, that are even skeptical towards the EU as such. I mean, the representatives of the AfD talk a lot about Dexit actually, or at least so many opt-outs that you wouldn't recognize Germany's membership in the EU anymore. I always counter with the British example, and then normally the debate goes down a little bit, but still it's a challenge. And when it comes to enlargement and the support for Ukraine in general, right? I think one thing that we're seeing is that the war to defend Ukraine is as much fought in Ukraine itself as it's also fought inside of the EU. What do I mean by that? If we don't have public support in our countries for supporting Ukraine, we will be in trouble. And Russia knows that. And this is why we're seeing a massive amount of disinformation campaigns, of hybrid attacks inside of the EU to weaken support for Ukraine in our own countries. And that applies to, of course, the important military support for Ukraine, but also the important perspective of EU enlargement. And therefore, I think we all, as the politicians who support these policies, we have to get better at convincing also our fellow citizens that it's in our own security interest to do so.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we all remember in the Maidan, the EU's flag being waved by crowds, and I'm sure that flag was also waved in the Orange Revolution in 2004. Marko, what's your take on the increase in support for far-right parties, skeptical of the European idea? What does that mean for the enlargement process, do you think?
I would, first of all, thank you, Martin, for the invitation. It's really lovely to be in Prague. It's the nicest city in the world. Yeah. Now, to your question, I don't really think that the European elections per se will have an effect on the issue of enlargement.
Sorry, just a bit closer, I think, to the mic.
Yeah. But the effect of the elections will definitely influence the political atmosphere in the member states. So after the elections, but also before the elections. So we are seeing a trend. So, for example, in the Netherlands, we had elections before, and now we have a government that will probably be more skeptical about the enlargement than the previous I guess the similar could happen in other member states. We don't know what will happen after the elections in France. We have elections in Austria this year, for example, elections in Belgium we just had. So the European political scene is changing. What I really cannot, not that I cannot understand, but I don't know exactly what's the reason that the central left political parties in Europe cannot sell the European topics as good as right-wing or central right-wing political parties. So why the migration is more interesting political topic than the green transition, for example? So both topics are European topics. I mean, we all have to deal with them because you cannot control migration, or you cannot do something big on green transition alone. You have to do it in a wider group. So both of them are European topics, and why certain political parties can work with these topics to convince their electorate to vote for them, and the others cannot. This is the question that we have to figure it out. How to address, because there are a lot of European topics that are that are vital, that we need to find solutions for. And we need to find ways how to address it for the internal publics as well. I believe there is a way, but for some of the topics it hasn't been really discovered yet.
Right. So the EU needs to communicate those topics better, then, perhaps. Miodrag, to you. I mean, what's your take as a representative of a country that's been waiting patiently to join the EU? When you look at the results of this election, how do you feel about them?
First of all, good morning, everyone, again. I'm especially glad to be in Czechia, in Prague, and thank you, other colleagues from the ministry and from the organizations for the invitation. I always used to say, even when I was coming here as the youth leader and afterwards as a foreign minister, I'm very fond of, for two reasons, very glad to be in Czechia. First of all, I'm very fond of Czech culture, especially the literature, and second, or maybe the first, my mother-in-law is Czech by origin, so my daughters are at least a quarter Czechs. Concerning the elections, I mean, the pendulum has gone to the right, not that far right as we were worried. So, first and second, that means that in the forthcoming future, in foreseeable future, we are most probably going to see a stagnation.
In enlargement?
Yes, because there is no logic to actually have an acceleration with the new political constellation, not only within the Parliament, European Parliament, but also in the composition of the new Commission. So we are looking forward to have at least the consolidation, some kind of confirmation of the general strategic intention of European friends and allies and partners of ours, first, and second, we would like to see, if I may be more specific, and I have this privilege of not being an active diplomat anymore, to be more, to maybe open and blunt if you want. We would like to see more active and more focused and more correct and honest, if you want, Commissioner for Good Neighborly Relations and Enlargement. The Hungarian gentleman performed very poorly for the reasons which are very ugly to be mentioned here and which have affected his performance and the background in a number of EU member countries. Support to his activities were detrimental not only for the aspirations and possibilities of my country, of our country, Montenegro, to get closer to certain further steps on the or within the EU agenda, but also in the entire region of Western Balkans. First. Second, I'm glad that I'm not actually forced here to criticize our American friends, because there would be a lot of reasons for that. But in a number of situations within EU, there is this process of very wrong and counterproductive policy of appeasement of Serbia, or if you want, Serbian regime in the Balkans. Because long story short, a there is one single common denominator or common ingredient in all the Western Balkan crisis situation, and that it is called Serbia. So when you talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's the negative Serbian influence. When you talk about Montenegro, the regression in our country, in political, cultural, economic, and overall security involution, it's Serbia influence. Needless to say, it also goes for Kosovo, and so on and so forth. So the first task, if you ask Montenegrins, or at least those Montenegrins who are truly and sincerely in favor of European integration, because we have the government led by a party movement which has the Europe in their name, but there is the ruling coalition, both the parliamentary majority and the present composition of our government, which are, long story short again, more or less Serbian/Russian proxies in a very open and direct way. So consequently, in order to keep and I end with that, the idea of enlargement alive, we should have first a new commission which is at least going to reconfirm the general strategic orientation first, and then to show in practical terms with the appointment of new commissioner that they are aware of the complexities, problems, and inabilities both of the region of the Western Balkans as well as European Union itself for the decisive steps in foreseeable future. And the bottom line concerning Ukraine and other of our friends at the eastern flank of the Union, we don't, one of your ideas or question or part of question was related, we don't see the problem at all. On the contrary, confirmation of European willingness on long-term level to assume Ukraine, Georgia, and others is something which is very important, and that is the best possible message to Kremlin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we'll talk about Ukraine in a second, but just there was mention of the Hungarian Commissioner for Enlargement, and I wanted to ask about Hungary. As I mentioned, Ursula von der Leyen says that formal negotiations, accession talks will begin by the end of June, or should begin by the end of June, before Hungary takes over. But what can the European Union do about one country which is, recalcitrant, different, goes its own way and blocks the ambitions of another? I know, Martin, you're quite outspoken about the power of veto that that members of the European Union have, and you're also quite outspoken about Hungary's role in the EU. So how do you feel about that?
You mean veto right?
Both the veto right and also what to do about an organization of 27 countries where one of them in the last 12 months has consistently gone against the grain of the consensus.
So thank you for this wonderful question. And regrettably, I'm not in the position in which Mio is. So
yes, understood.
But speaking about the rule of Hungary or any single state which decide to stop by veto right any single decision, I would propose maybe the easiest way is to pay sometimes the most expensive coffee break.
Yes, right. This is how the very concept of Ukraine becoming a member went forward.
As long as we are not able to go further in the debate about veto right or anonymity and QMV, because this is very simple or maybe very complicated, I could hardly imagine to stop anonymous voting by anonymous decision. So what we are facing now, the situation is that we have very likely to start the discussion and to find solution how to protect the European interest against one single troublemaker or somebody who is playing maybe not even for his national interest, maybe not only for his political or personal interest, but very likely for interest of someone who is out of EU. And there is ongoing debate. I'm very happy to speak about it with our German colleagues, because they are on the same track as we are. And we understand that it is definitely not so easy at the moment to break this resistance against QMV. And we are looking for some other ways how to protect the rights and interests of the small countries because they are afraid about majority voting because they could be overvoted. On the other hand, how to make Europe more flexible, sufficient, able to react on some black swans they are coming as a war or pandemic or whatever, catastrophic. So we are having in our minds several different models how to do that. One of them is to set up some kind of blocking minority. It cannot be only one country, but let's say 2 or 3, or let's say some certain number of inhabitants together, or something like that. Not to give this instrument to only one troublemaker or non-team player. And the second one is to set up some precise, or more precise condition. What does it mean a national interest? How to protect national interest even without using veto right. So this is ongoing debate, and as I said, I'm afraid that this is a debate which will be very, very long and very complicated. And back to the question what we start with, at the moment it's the biggest danger in my eyes that the big players will be very busy with their domestic issues and they will be not able to put so much energy in this very complicated issue. On the other hand, what I'm repeating again and again, we have to continue in enlargement procedure because we cannot afford to have this piece of or region of instability or tensions so near to our borders, and we have to keep them on our side. We cannot let them fall down and let them behind. I'm in Western Balkans as well as Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine. So we have to find the instrument how to help them and how to send them the message. We are on your side. We are really interested to have you on board, and we are doing our best. And second part of the sentence is, but you should do your homeworks as well.
Yeah, sure. Anna, do you think that EU enlargement from 27 to, if I do my maths now, I mean, if all 9 entered, it would be 36 countries. Can enlargement happen with that power of veto still existing in any form? Because one could argue that it makes the whole decision-making in the European Union non-viable when you have that power surviving.
Well, I think the question is, do we want it to happen that way,
yes,
right?
Yes, yes.
Because the issue is that I'm actually, even though some people might not think that of me, but I'm actually a big fan of this idea that we take decisions in the EU by consensus, because that's really the European spirit, that we sit together with 27 in the room, that we bring all our arguments to the table, that we discuss, and that we find a solution that maybe each and every individual of us hasn't thought about before, but that in the end brings all of us forward and reflects all the national interests that are legitimate national interests.
Does that consensus include one member going out for, as Martin said, very expensive
exactly.
coffee breaks?
I like that kind of idea, but the problem is that principle doesn't function if you have members that move away from the consensus, and particularly the consensus on values in the EU. Because I think what we've seen in recent years with Hungary, with also Poland in some ways before the government changed, is that really you had governments that for ideological reasons blocked the whole EU from moving further, right? I mean, just to illustrate, I mean, of course we all know about how, I mean, the Hungarians have blocked funds for Ukraine, they've blocked the enlargement process for Ukraine, they've blocked actually clear language vis-a-vis Serbia, they are blocking currently support for Armenia, right? So it's really in many areas, and they're continuously blocking any kind of statement that use the word gender, right? I mean, that's what I really would call ideology, to not be able to move in a consensus of 27 just because your narrow perspective tells you that you need to object one single word, right? So that is a fundamental problem, and I think we really need to make sure that these issues that have caused a detour now often for the EU, a detour that sometimes involves drinking of coffee, that that actually will end up in a dead end if we are more member states. So
Yes.
that's the challenge, and therefore we have worked very hard to reach a consensus actually in the EU, which I think we have now, that enlargement and reforms need to go in parallel, and these reforms need to address two critical issues. One, and I think that's actually the most important one, is the issue of values. How can we really make sure as EU that we don't only preach rule of law and fundamental values to other countries or to countries that might want to join, but that we also live by these standards every day. So we need to improve the instruments also that we have here to make sure that member countries adhere to the rule of law. And secondly, we need to think about our capacity to act. And there are several issues that we need to discuss here, and one of them is also the veto, right?
Yep. Thank you. Marko, do you have anything to add to that? Do you think, as the EU gets bigger and bigger, that looking for consensus, it'll become less and less of a meaningful organization because there would just be so few things that all 27 or 36 countries actually do agree on?
Look, I think the most important question is how to really boost the enlargement now, because 2 years ago, after Russia attacked Ukraine, enlargement became an interesting topic again. So we started to discuss it also among all the EU 27. Before that, it was just basically a couple of countries that were reminding everybody else that we need to take care about this black spot in the Western Balkans and about the eastern border if we want to have Europe as the united continent that can play a strong and active role also in the world. So, okay, we agreed that enlargement is a geopolitical necessity, but from then on, actually nothing really happened. So we have an agreement, political agreement, that we have to do something, but we are not doing much. What we are doing is empowering a little bit the European institutions to build the capacities so that, for example, at the European Commission, you have a little bit, couple of more people that are dealing with the enlargement in the particular countries, this yes, but the whole procedure is the same. Now, what does this mean in practice? So, now we have 9 candidate countries, and Kosovo will probably become one next, well, someday. So those 10 countries will have to open and close 350 chapters altogether. So, every member state has 35 chapters. So 10 candidate countries, 350 chapters to open and close. For each chapter to open and close, you need unanimity. So everybody needs to agree. What happens in reality is that everybody at this very moment that wants to either open or close the chapter is being blocked. Everybody. Albania is being blocked. North Macedonia is being blocked. Let's hope Montenegro will not be blocked, but the prospects are not so good, unfortunately. We'll see what will happen with Ukraine. Hungary is not blocking Ukraine yet, but let's hope they will not, of course. But, and I don't want to really defend or to judge member states when they're doing this, because also when we were joining, the interest of the neighboring country is higher because the cooperation between the neighboring countries is higher. It's more intense. So when Slovenia joined the EU, we had to change our constitution twice before we joined the EU for several reasons. Mostly because of our neighboring countries, very friendly neighboring countries, but they had their own ideas what we should do too. So we did, and we are not sorry for it. We are happy that we did, and we are prospering from this. But imagine now 350 chapters, being, and all the chapters being blocked by somebody. So that's why we were, trying to figure out something, and we were drafting some ideas. So we have, together with Anna, we presented a paper in Brussels to really introduce QMV, so qualified majority voting, when opening the chapters, only opening the chapters. For closing the chapters, there'll still have to be a consensus.
So that would still effectively mean one country vetoing another country's EU aspirations,
yeah, but
if it could find one chapter in which you disagree.
You have to let the candidate countries to start negotiating.
Right, okay.
If you're blocking them at the very beginning, then forget about it.
Okay, understood, right. Miodrag.
Yeah, so I would not like to repeat what the panelists have said about the internal EU issues, where we sympathize with the problems and the rather complicated structure with so many conflicting interests, and the political constellation is becoming worse than before, as we have said. Two small examples which could actually help us to understand the perspective from outside of the EU. So let me start with the first one. I was for 4 years, almost 4 years, the ambassador to the Holy See, to the Order of Malta. And in Rome, it allows you to read the Italian press or to meet Italian friends, both from the center-right or center-left, from my youth days. So not, if you believe me, and it can be checked, of course, not a single article, not a single op-ed, not a single sentence idea for these 4 years in Italian press, whether it's center-right, center-left, right or left, about the enlargement. It's not a political topic in that country, and it can be, of course, said for a number of other EU member states. But in Italy, just for the sake of example, it's a non-issue, because if you do mention that, it harms you politically. And it was confirmed to me in very direct, friendly talks with my friends, both from the center-right and center-left. That is the first example. The second one, because I do agree with Martin that there is a part of the job to be done on our side. Just to explain to you one small detail when it comes to Montenegro. We have the government which I have described before, briefly. So recently, the foreign policy of Montenegro, even until 2020, when there was a change, as you probably all know, in the government, the best part of our policy was the foreign policy. Montenegro was recognized as a very constructive regional player, the unique country which could host any kind of event, being bilateral, multilateral, of the Balkan or Western Balkan composition, which is not the case in a number of our neighboring countries. Our government, the foreign ministry, being officially, publicly, very much in favor of European integrations, very much oriented towards the EU agenda, has managed in last less than 6 months to have 2 protest notes from Zagreb, from Croatia, on the issues which are very sensitive and which actually deal not only with our bilateral relations, but also our expression of the true orientation concerning the EU agenda. 2 very bitter and direct diplomatic protest notes, and on the top of that, 3 of them from Bosnia and Herzegovina, because the leader of our parliament, who is a gentleman very close to Putin and to Vučić, has managed actually to insult not once or twice, but 3 times our Bosnian friends, questioning the very unity of that country and emphasizing the so-called statehood of so-called Republika Srpska. So the only country where the present government of Montenegro is ready to be fully cooperative and very friendly and very forward-looking, despite the very negative influence coming from Serbia, is Serbia itself, which actually shows you that, with due respect, and I will end with that, we highly appreciate the readiness of our European friends to continue with the idea of Montenegro becoming closer to EU in the future. In the same time, on the other side, we are afraid that it's going to be a very disappointing ending of that story, or at least in foreseeable future, that there is not going to be a proper response from Montenegrin side. That is the problem we should be aware of. And the last issue is maybe, how to say, the most difficult one. You know, until there is no reconception of European overall attitude towards the Western Balkans. Not only, let me not be obsessed by Montenegro for a second. You know, there is almost permanent crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Just to end, Dayton Treaty is off and out and over and out for years now, but there is no viable replacement. As you have mentioned, Rob, there is the lacking of 5 EU member states in recognition of Kosovo. And we have even ideas in some major European countries that the new government, for example, in France, the far-right government, the Front National, could actually de-recognize Kosovo.
Yes,
And
I've read that. Yeah.
so the whole thing, the pendulum is going in wrong direction, in a direction which is not favoring the enlargement. And the primary challenge of our European friends is actually going to be to reverse that very historic trend.
Thank you. Let's talk about Ukraine. Let's start with a little experiment. As I mentioned, Martin, you were in Kyiv in 2004 during the Orange Revolution when they were flying those EU flags, and of course we remember the Maidan as well, and the whole Ukraine recent history has been so affected by its aspirations, or aspirations at least of part of its society to go west rather than east and join the family of European nations and become an EU member. But that was 20 years ago, when one could argue that Ukraine began changing course. I just want to ask all of you, let's give it another 20 years, so let's say 2044, how many of you think that Ukraine will be a member of the EU in 20 years' time? Please raise your hands if you think Ukraine will already be in the EU in 2044. Okay. All right, and Miodrag, right. Thank you very much. Well, then there is a sense of optimism there. It is, of course, such a huge country. As I mentioned, it's the second biggest country in Europe after Russia. And even putting aside the war and the fact that, you know, almost a fifth of it is occupied by the army of another state, what about its agricultural sector? What would happen to the common agricultural policy if Ukraine were admitted? French farmers are angry at the best of times. What happens if a huge amount of EU funds starts being diverted to keep the world's bread basket growing grain and so on? Isn't there a danger that admitting a country of the sheer geographical size and geopolitical complexity as Ukraine could sink the EU project?
Me?
Sure.
Sorry. I have seen this very optimistic picture of how many of us really
surprising, right? I thought
even
it'd
for
be,
me.
5 or 10.
To be absolutely fair, I think it's a picture of wishful thinking.
Okay.
You've
just been told by Martin there.
We all of us, I believe, we are wishing for Ukraine the best, and we believe the best for Ukraine is to be a member of EU. And also, let me add, I really believe the best for EU is to have Ukraine on our side and have Ukraine as a member. You mentioned several question marks what are in the air, and everybody knows about it, or if not, we will know very soon, because it's definitely not easy. But what we, I guess, are having in mind is exactly, Ukraine is at the moment the easiest part of the potential future EU, in which we can build up as a buffer, as a first line to protect the rest of the European Union. They are already doing it today because they are suffering, dying, and bleeding just for protection of our region, because everybody knows, and now is more and more clear that Russia is just starting their expansion towards west through Ukraine, and if Ukraine is going to fall down, then we are in biggest danger. So this is some kind of geopolitical reason why we should support them and help them, and to cover all of those question marks and to solve this solution, to find solution for this question. Let me add one personal history. I met a few months ago, a newly appointed ambassador of Ireland. He came into my office and he said, you know what, I am a huge fan of enlargement. And I remember myself in Ireland when we were entering in Ireland, and the rest of the member states was very skeptical to our future and to our capability to fulfill all of the conditions and to be a regular and fair member of EU. And we did it. And then he said, I used to be an Irish diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in time when you have been accepted as members. And it was the same situation again. There were so many reservations and doubts about your capability to be a regular and fair member of EU. And you did it. I'm a little bit afraid that we didn't it yet, but okay, it's another question. We are in and we are doing our best to be a proper member. So why we shouldn't believe that even the new members could go through this same path? By very beginning, a lot of skepticism and reservations and doubts, but if we are able to help them, they can do that. And we really need them and they need us. And we are under bigger and bigger threat from East. Not only, but mainly from East, and not only Russia, there are other players. So I really believe that under this idea that we really need to have this huge country on our side, we will be able to go through all questions. So this is maybe the reason why so many people believe that by 2044, Ukraine will be a member of EU. I'm very optimistic.
Great, optimistic. Anna, is the EU biting off more than it can chew with Ukraine?
We have to make sure that a larger European Union indeed also becomes a stronger European Union. And for that end, we are emphasizing so much that we need to have reform and enlargement go out in parallel. Because Ukraine is not joining the EU because they want to have a chunk of agricultural subsidies. I mean, the issue is that the Ukrainian agricultural sector is competitive without subsidies, right? This is what the Polish farmers are making all this fuss about the whole time, right? So therefore it's clear that before Ukraine joins, we need to adjust the rules in the common agricultural policy to make sure, and I think this is long overdue anyway, that we don't pay these agricultural subsidies to the billionaires that own large chunks of land, but that we use these agricultural subsidies to support particularly the small-scale farmers that do a lot of service for their communities by protecting also biodiversity, by protecting our also cultural heritage, by ensuring also our food production here, and that it doesn't that we also make a cap on the agricultural subsidies, so that these large companies don't manage to skim off so much of them. And I think that could be an answer also to how do we get the agricultural policy ready for Ukraine to join. Then we need to talk, of course, also about cohesion policy. That's another issue where we need to find an answer to. But here I'm very optimistic because we can see that the large round of enlargements has really led to a rise in living standards, both in the old member states and in the new member states. I think Czechia has sort of tripled their its GDP or something like that, more or less. I mean, that's amazing. And I don't think that would have been possible without joining the EU. So that the whole point, and I think we need to talk more about this, is that by working together in the European Union, by creating a larger internal market, we enlarge also the pie. We don't have to fight sort of about who gets which size of the pie in its current form, but by working more together, we make our companies also more competitive, we create a larger pie, and thus more prosperity and more income also for all of us.
It sounds great, but what about the elephant in the room of the biggest war being fought in Europe taking place on the territory of Ukraine?
Marko, I mean, the war needs to end. I mean, that's very clear, and there's one very clear path for this war to end is by Putin to stop fighting.
But if it ends in a sort of typical Putin-esque Russian scenario of Moldova, Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, a conflict which is frozen, even though no one in this room and no one in Brussels and no one in Washington wants the conflict to be frozen, but it may end up as a frozen conflict. Can Ukraine join the EU when that conflict hasn't been resolved forever?
Well, we're currently at the stage where we're doing all we can. We can probably even do more to support Ukraine with military means to defend itself. I'm going on the weekend to the peace conference in Switzerland to also discuss exactly about scenarios of how this brutal war can end. But for me, it's very clear it cannot end in a victory of Russia, because that will make all of us much more insecure.
Safe, yes. Marko, anything to add?
Look, on the numbers, it's for me a little bit amusing how we forget our history sometimes. So in the last 20 years, 13 countries joined the EU, right? It's the number of population that joined the EU is twice as much as Ukraine, or even 3 times probably. All of these countries are net receivers. So, and we managed to handle this.
It's a bit of a red herring to talk about Ukraine's enormous size.
Look, UK left EU. It's twice as big as Ukraine by population.
Right.
And it was a big net payer to the budget. So we managed, right? I mean, we're sorry for UK to leave, but we managed. I think we'll manage with Ukraine as well. I mean, there's no question about if we'll manage with the Western Balkan countries. I mean, Montenegro has what, 620,000 inhabitants. If EU is not able to absorb this, I mean, what are we talking about as EU being a global player, So when we are talking about the next enlargements, we have to be clear. EU has done this before and did it successfully, and is much stronger since it did this. So EU right now is competing with the big players around the world, and I think it's vital for us to really unite this area politically, in security terms, in market terms, and that's why the enlargement is, if you asked how many people think that in 20 years Ukraine will be a member of the EU, I think if Ukraine and other candidate countries will not be members of the EU in 20 years, then probably EU will even not exist anymore in 20 years, because it will not be competitive towards other big players, because we have to make sure that we reduce the risks of insecurity on our continent. And if we are not doing this, then we have a big problem on the long term.
Miodrag, can Ukraine join before the war is ended? Could we have a kind of Cyprus solution where all of Cyprus is in the EU, right? But the EU law only applies in parts in the north part of the island?
No, I don't believe that.
You don't believe that?
Given the number of differences, not only in terms of territory or population, with due respect to our Cypriot friends, it's a totally different story. Marko took 2 ideas which I wanted to emphasize. First of all, in history, concerning these kind of very important historic decisions, there is a context and momentum. The element of right time to do right things. And with due respect, and in the context of Western Balkans, specifically Montenegro, maybe EU has missed the opportunity back in 2018. Because even the representatives of the present government acknowledge the fact that concerning the famous interim benchmark assessment report, we were already at the same level back in 2018 as we are now. Concerning Ukraine, I read this one article this morning from one of the American papers. There are no 2 scenarios, but 3 scenarios in Ukraine. The first one is some kind of short war, or the abrupt ending of the war, which would acknowledge the occupation or territorial gain of Russia. And that is impossible. That is a non-scenario from the European or Western perspective or point of view. Second scenario is the total, immediate, or very short-term liberation of Ukraine, which is unfortunately not a realistic projection. And the third one seems to be the most realistic one, and especially you have mentioned actually a period of 20 years. Since we live in an accelerated history, it's a very long period. And it seems to be the case that the best way to tackle a problem of Russian aggression on Ukraine is actually to show the readiness not only of EU, but also of the Euro-Atlantic community, comprising also US and UK, to actually wage the war with Russia for foreseeable future. Whatever it takes, however long it may be, it is very important to send that signal or message to Kremlin that the war will be fought until the end. Because, long story short, I don't believe that Putin and his clique can actually handle the war for example, 5 years or 10 years more. So consequently, both in the case of Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, as well as in the Western Balkans, it seems to me that a Euro-Atlantic community, or if you want more specifically, EU, needs a major crisis, a major problem, a confrontation with the major danger in order to act. In this very moment, we have an unforeseeable problem in the context of its potential developments in Ukraine, and we have a stalemate in the Balkans, where allow me to be slightly less pessimistic about the Balkans than on long-term level in the context of Ukraine. As we speak, in the Balkans, Russia is gaining positions in each and every country you can mention, including, let us not forget, North Macedonia, where the presidential elections have actually had the famous pendulum going very much to the right, where you have a nationalistic now political constellation in that country, which is also very important for us. So for us, it's important actually to have, let me end with that, European integration, even in the cases which were mentioned by Marko, were also the result of one side effect, which is related to US also. There was always there was a better understanding and mutual attitude and better communication and cooperation between US and EU. There was a synchronicity at the time of all these, in foreign policy issues, in all these cases of new member states. That is not the case now as we speak. That is not the case in Western Balkans. We have let me put it slightly without being specific, a very awkward, a very anti-American foreign policy in the Western Balkans. And we are witnessing the fact that it was not only because of Trump administration. We have, and we still have some kind of continuation of Trump policy in post-Trump period, which is very unfortunate. And I don't want to go to details, but we have the statements and positions of Ambassador Hill of US in Belgrade, which is not appeasing Vučić, which is actually cooperating with Vučić in the way which actually frustrates not only us in the Western Balkans, and I end with that, but also a number of our Western European friends or EU friends.
Very good, thank you. Well, just before we get on to some questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask one last question of you, for purely personal reasons. Do you think that my country was the last to leave the EU? We've been talking a lot about enlargement today, but if we talk about the reverse, is the process unstoppable? Will it always expand, or will it also contract? Martin, do you think any other countries will leave, will have left in 20 years, say?
Of course, you'll never know. There is nothing certain in this world, in EU world. But I really believe that Brexit was a very sad issue, especially for me or for us Czechs. We were always, almost always, the so-called like-minded country. We were counting on your support in many issues in the free market, etc. So we were really very, very disappointed by Brexit, and I think at least one half of Britons as well. And now, few years after, I think more Britons now understand than used to, they understood before, that it was not a good decision. This is something what is not making me happy, but on the other hand, as per my reading, the rest of the European members, now they see that it is not the solution of their problems to make some kind of exit. Even the most extremist countries, parties, now are not speaking anymore about exit because they see the result for Great Britain, and they understand that it's definitely not helping to solve the domestic problems. Even worse, it's worse and worse than it used to be within EU. So I think this bad example is a very good example for the rest of us.
Anna, your views?
Yeah, I fully agree. This is a deterrent for anyone aspiring to do so within the EU, because it's very clear that this simple promise, this populist promise to take back control, that this failed in a globalized world with all the challenges that we face, climate crisis, migration, security challenge from Russia and all of that. We are just, all of us, too small to deal with this on our own. So we need to work together, and then we become somewhere close to being able to solve the issue. So I think what we see really in UK is the danger of this current populist narrative. The populist narrative that somehow there is an easy solution to all the problems, that we can easily just say, okay, let's have peace in Ukraine. We can easily just say, okay, we become prosper if we shut everyone out. That we can easily say, if we turn a blind eye on climate change and stop the Green Deal, then our life model will just be able to continue forever. This is just simply not the case. The world is more complicated, and I think that's exactly what Brexit showed all of us, that these simple promises, we all should be very skeptical towards them.
And yet, Marko, those simple promises, simple solutions, they resonated in the elections a week ago, didn't they? So clearly there are lots of people in Europe who like the sound of those simple answers.
Yeah, that's true. And I would like to ask myself, you know, what will happen if we'll not be able to answer those simple answers? Because I always like when the Germans say we are too small, you know. I heard this a lot in Berlin, but it's true. It's completely true. What about Slovenia? I mean, we are also. I mean, we are even smaller, of course. So the problem we have right at the beginning, right now, is that geopolitically, what we are observing is the rise of China, rise of India, rise of Brazil, which is a kind of a normal thing, you know. But this means, of course, that the tensions are getting higher and higher between the blocs. And the EU, Europe, not EU, Europe simply needs to act, to work together, to cooperate, if we want to be competitive among the others. And that's what's happening around the world. So if somebody leaves the EU, I think it's not a disaster if we still manage to keep this cooperation among each other. We have a very good cooperation with UK, and it's of course we're sad that UK left, but we need to keep this cooperation going on in Europe, and that's why the integration process, the enlargement process, and you know, trying to work with everybody in Europe is so vitally important for each of us if we want to survive in this globalized world.
Thank you. Miodrag, finally, do you think the UK was the last country to leave?
Yes, because there is no. It was a very anti-historic decision. It's a kind of irregularity in history, even for the former global empire. What I would like, agreeing with other panelists, of course, there is a major crisis on the horizon. Not only potential, but true one, which could be the re-election of Donald Trump. And on one side, it's a disaster, a major problem on global level. But on the other side, that could be a new impetus for the unity within EU. You know, but that would be very drastic confrontation with anti-historic process in that country. on one side, but on the other, it would emphasize the necessity to stay together and to consider enlargement as something which is, and I do agree with Anna, which could actually make European idea and European Union as such stronger. So, which confirms that we need major crises in order to have improvements, to have some kind of better strategic reasoning and thinking concerning our mutual interests, which are actually should be pan-European one, including the countries which are still not there. So Euro-Atlantic dimension should not be forgotten, also in the terms of security, which actually indirectly but concretely enough affects also the issues we are discussing today.
Thank you. Right, so let's get to some questions from the audience. Quick fire round as we have 10 minutes left. So, first question. Did Georgia meet the European standards for membership in the European Union during the presidency of Mikhail Saakashvili from 2008 to 2013? Any views on that?
As far as I know, no.
As far as you know, no.
I mean, you mean you meet the standards when you complete the whole procedure. So at the end, when you close all the chapters, then you meet the standards to join. So the short answer is no. At that time, they didn't meet all the standards to join.
Anna?
Maybe if I can just add one sentence, what is clear that the current government led by Georgian Dream moves away from the European Union, which is a big shame because we see every day on the streets of Georgia that the citizens really want to be part of the European Union because they don't want to fall under Russian oppression. And I find this personally also very inspiring because they show every day what the EU stands for. It stands for a life in freedom, in prosperity, without oppression. And this is really something worth fighting for and worth also protecting. And it's really a shame that the current government of Georgia moves away from this vision, from this dream. But if the Georgians change course again, the doors are wide open for them.
Martin?
During Saakashvili's time, I think they made a huge progress, but it was not enough. They didn't reach the goal. And to the recent situation, I don't like to say that, but I see kind of similarity with Belarusia. What I mean is to have a very pro-democratic and pro-freedom or pro-West-oriented population staying against the very conservative or pro-Russian leadership. Thanks God, Georgia is so far still much more democratic country than Belarusia is, but I'm a little bit afraid about the future development. So I don't see for near future any good perspectives for Georgia. Regrettably, I'm very sad to say that.
Right, pessimistic then. I think this is probably for you, Miodrag, perhaps all of you, but if Republika Srpska separates from Bosnia after the referendum, will Bosnia lose its candidate status for the European Union?
My answer is which referendum?
Okay.
It's not going to be organized, then it's impossible. Actually, it would mean war. Long story short, it would mean war, and war sponsored by Serbia/Russia. And the whole, it was actually nice to see and to hear after this manifestation of so-called pan-Serbian gathering in Belgrade recently. Finally, we had a clear-cut and direct messages, not only from the U.S. Embassy in Pristina, but also from the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo, emphasizing without a hint of double meaning the absolute principle of unity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Republika Srpska is an entity, unfortunately created on the basis of genocide there, to be frank. And consequently, it should remain within, and will remain within Bosnia and Herzegovina, but the overall situation, as I said before, is actually related to the inability, with my due apology, to Western friends, not only European ones, but also Americans, inability of Euro-Atlantic community to actually find the solution for the post-Dayton Treaty arrangement for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina is now organized along the lines and principles and standards which are inapplicable in any of the European countries. Whatever country you choose, if you apply the Dayton Treaty standards and lines of divisions in any country, Belgium, for example, it would not exist in a year. It would be in a major crisis. So consequently, the unity of Bosnia is a paramount condition for the actually is the core problem in the Balkans. Before Bosnia is resolved, all the neighbors, Montenegro including, are going to face enormous troubles.
Right, thanks. Perhaps we'll move on to another question, just because I've got a lot here. Belarus, is it time to bring Belarusians back to the European family that they belong to? What can be done about the relationship between Belarus and Russia, which I know is an extremely complicated, complex relationship? Marko?
At the moment, I'm afraid not much, because Belarus is a country that's clearly cooperating with the aggressor, with the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and I would only wish for Belarus. I have quite a lot of friends from Belarus that I know from before, and I know that a big number of Belarusian citizens is of course in favor of this democratic transition, of democratic process, and I sincerely wish for them to be a part of European family one day. But at the moment, realistically speaking, this is a very difficult thing to help them in order to.
Martin, you?
I have also many good friends in Belarus, and I feel very sorry for them, because I don't see as a correct model to put Russia and Belarus in the same set and package, because as per my knowledge, Russians are supporting Putin very strongly. This is not the situation in Belarus. On the other hand, we cannot afford at the moment to be too much open for Belarusian regime as a state, as a country. So what we do is to support some democratic forces if they are there and if they are still free, if they are not jailed or sentenced. And what we are doing already is we are supporting the office of President Tikhanovskaya here, and we are trying to send them as much energy and support, but we cannot open the border at the moment, even if the Belarusians are asking for it very strongly. So for me, it's not very fair to put them in the one package, but we don't have any other option at the moment.
Okay. I think one final question, because it's a nice kind of philosophical question on which to end. If enlargement helps protect new members, should it be prioritized over the stability of the EU on the whole? Anna, is enlargement better, more of a priority than the overall stability of the EU?
I think one is a condition for the other. I think somebody here said before that if we don't manage to enlarge our area of prosperity, of stability, to the Western Balkans, also to Ukraine, to Moldova, then our stability is in danger, because we see now what happens in these gray zones. If we're not there and present as we should be, then somebody else is there, Russia, China. So it really threatens our stability as well, and therefore I think we need to do both. We need to make sure that enlargement happens and happens swiftly, that we really change our course also from being like, okay, you can enlarge once you fulfill our standards, to we want you to become our member, we will help you to fulfill the standards. It's a different mindset, a different approach. And then at the same time, in parallel, we need to get ready as EU for this enlargement, but I think this is not rocket science, as Marko has said. We've done it before, we can do it again, and I think the solutions are already on the table for that.
Look, I think it's the same thing. I mean, basically, Europe will not be stable if it does not enlarge and make sure that we have a clear borders, that we know what is Europe, what is European Union, that we actually diminish the risks that we have in the middle of European Union. The Western Balkans is basically in the middle of the European Union, or on our borders. It's like, maybe to conclude, it's like, you have a big family, you start building a house, you have many rooms in your house, but then there are 3 rooms where you don't really know what's going on there. So I think you have to,
I've got 2 kids, so I think my house is a bit like that.
Yeah. So it's, if you want to have your, a house that you feel safe in, you need to have the control over the whole house.
I think we can divide those two things. It's, as Anna already said, I don't have so much to add. It's connected somehow, and stability is dependent on our power and unity, let's say. And the bolder and bigger we are, the more stable we could be and should be. And this is my opinion.
Okay, the bolder and bigger we are, the more we should be, Miodrag, do you think?
I would add that the enlargement would be actually the direct, the most visible sign of stability. No, enlargement is a function of stability. It should be understood like that. So let me end with one message which I have been repeating for years now when it comes to Western Balkans and EU. You know, in the Western Balkans, not only there, but in the Western Balkans specifically, the recent history has shown that it is better to do things one day prematurely, one day before they are finally ready to be done, than to wait, symbolically speaking, a day or two more and to be desperately late, to be historically late to do them. And that is the message not only for Montenegro, but also for Bosnia and Herzegovina, for Kosovo, and then the end of the story, or beginning, if you want, for Serbia itself. So appeasement is not a good policy. There should be a straightforward, direct communication saying that this is our readiness to support you, but as Martin has emphasized in the very beginning, there should be your appropriate response to our support. So that response, as far as we know, comes to some extent from Bosnia and Montenegro, to some extent, and even more, if you want, from Kosovo, which is not a surprise. Whether there is a response then from Western society, from Euro-Atlantic community, is another topic, another issue, and no response from Serbia. So consequently, it's a twofold issue: stability on one side of the medal, enlargement on the other, and where the function enlargement is the function of stability, to my modest opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, please, all of you, join me in thanking our panelists, Miodrag Vlahović, Marko Štucin, Dr. Anna Lührmann, and Martin Dvořák. Thank you very much indeed.